Thursday, February 1st, 2018, Monaco 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. I'd like to talk about the UK pensions deficit, and this is not for government pensions, this is for the private sector. And I think there's a big problem brewing with pension schemes in the UK. I'm sure it's not the only country where we have that problem. And the reason I'm talking about it is because one of the viewers asked me to talk about Carillion, which is a big government contractor that went bust a few weeks ago. And they left about 800 million in pensions liability, maybe even more. So I've dug into this Carillion story, but what I found is more, how can I say, Carillion is just like the tip of the iceberg, and Carillion actually, the people who work for Carillion and have pensions with them might actually be quite lucky that it happened now. So let's start now with an article that came out 2 days ago on Yahoo Finance UK, and it says 2 out of 3 UK pension schemes are in the red to the tune of £200 billion. Interesting that he notes, this guy Mark Dorman, who wrote the article, mentions £210 billion. But at the end of the article, he also says reports from consultants at PricewaterhouseCoopers last October estimated the total deficit of all the defined benefit pension funds in the UK to stand at a record 410 billion. So I think I'll take the higher number because these numbers are always underestimated. So let's say it's in between 310 billion pounds. That's like over $1 trillion in pension deficit. So what does the article say? What else did it say? It says that some of the 3,710 schemes are in deficit according to the Pensions Protection Fund watchdog. So that's the PPF. The PPF was created through government legislature, but it's not backed by the government. And basically, the companies that have pension schemes, they pay an annual stipend or fee to this fund. And if they have a trouble eventually, they will get bailed out not bailed out, but the people with the pension plans will be compensated at around 90% of what they're owed. But the interesting thing is that he says in this article, the biggest deficits include BT, Royal Dutch Shell, BP or British Petroleum, Tesco, and BAE. And if you add up their deficits, it's around 36 billion pounds just for those 5 companies. And then I've gone into the PPF, the Pension Protection Fund website. And this is what they say here. What is the PPF? The Pension Protection Fund was set up in April 2005 to protect millions of people who belong to defined benefit, that is, final salary pension schemes in the United Kingdom. If their employers fail and their pension schemes cannot afford to pay what they promise, we will pay compensation for their lost pensions. If the PPF didn't exist, members would simply receive their share of what was available in the scheme, which might be very little. Currently, hundreds of thousands of people are receiving compensation from the PPF, more than they would have received if the PPF didn't exist. The other thing that I looked at and found really interesting from their own website is this. We have now been protecting members' futures for over a decade. The PPF has evolved to an organization which has over 28 billion pounds of assets. under management and is responsible for more than 235,000 members. So here you have the PPF, which is supposed to protect pension schemes. They have 20 billion pounds in assets, and the five biggest, let's say, companies with the five biggest deficits that I talked about earlier, they have 36 billion in liabilities. So, and then you have thousands of others that have a pensions deficit. So, do you really think this 28 billion would be enough if there was a crisis, a financial crisis? And why do I talk about a financial crisis? Well, because if you look also into the where the PPF is putting their money, where this 28 billion pounds is invested, 58% of it is in cash and bonds. So cash, UK gilts, annuities, global government bonds, global aggregate bonds. I'm not sure what they mean by that, including credit and emerging market debt. So they've got almost 60% of that money in the bond market, which anything I would say has topped. We saw interest rates bottom in July 2016, and we know how interest rates are rising right now all over the world, even in the UK. So they've got also 22.5% in alternative investments, which is like property, private equity, alternative credit infrastructure, farmland, timberland, and absolute return strategy. So this 22.5% is in very illiquid assets, private equity. It's difficult. It's not like easy to sell. Maybe right now that the credit market is still functioning well, it's easier. And they've only got 7% of the money in public equities or in the stock market. And then 12.5% in hybrid assets, which they consider illiquid assets with hedging characteristics. So what is that? So my point is, right now, if you look at the last, since 2009, 2010, these last few years, the central banks of the world, especially the Western world, the UK, US, ECB, Japan, they've souped up the credit market so much. They've printed trillions and trillions of dollars of money to buy bonds, to how can I say, inflate the stock market, inflate asset prices. I don't think it can get much more inflated than we are, and we have this huge problem of pensions deficit in the UK. Can you imagine when things turn around? What will happen to these pension schemes? And I think the problem is that they've been badly managed by the companies. The other problem is that the zero interest rate policies have made it harder for pension funds and the companies to manage their, the assets and their liabilities towards pensioners and people who invest in pensions, because they haven't had a steady, government bond return of 6 or 7% like they used to have maybe 20, 30 years ago. Now with interest rates at zero, and I think this is a big problem, because if the bond market really turns around as it is right now, and if it like snowballs, it could be a big problem, not for just the UK pension schemes, but everywhere else. I think in the States, the states themselves are in big trouble. They have big pensions deficits. I'm not sure. I haven't looked into US corporations. So I can't comment on it. I think demographics is another problem. The baby boomers are retiring, and there's less workers to finance the pensions, and also earnings of present workers haven't gone up as much. So like people who are retired already, in relative terms, they're still earning quite a lot compared to what the people who are supposed to help them finance their pensions are earning. So it's a huge problem. But the granddaddy, I think, of the biggest problem in UK pensions are not FTSE 100 companies or private companies, but it's the USS. And what is the USS? Well, it's the university's superannuation scheme, and you're gonna find this quite amazing. And this is from a story in the FT that I also found from last year. Digging into this, and it says university pension fund deficit soars to 17.5 billion. Retirement scheme has largest gap between assets and liabilities in the UK. So that's so basically, I'll read a little bit about this fund. The deficit at the UK university sector's main pension scheme has soared by 9 billion over the past year to 17.5 billion, making it the largest on record at any British retirement fund and putting the rocky finances of higher education under pressure. The university's superannuation scheme, which provides pensions for academics, has had more than 390,000 members, recorded retirement liabilities of 77.5 billion at March 31st, dwarfing its assets of 60 billion. And it goes on to say, USS deficit is much higher than that recorded by BT, the telecoms group, which has the largest pension scheme of any UK company. BT recorded a deficit of 9 billion at March 31st, 2017. And it goes on to say, John Ralph, an independent pension consultant, told the Financial Times the options for fixing USS deficit were unpalatable. And then I also found an article by a professor called Dennis Leach. Professor Dennis Leach is Emeritus Professor of Economics at Warwick University. And in it, he basically says that he doesn't understand why the USS fund is being so conservative, that they're all overestimating their liabilities. And he says at the end of his article, it says, therefore, we can argue that because the USS is protected by the PPF, a statutory body supported by the government, the greatest part of its risk is removed. The valuation should therefore be done without such a large amount of prudence, and therefore the deficit would be much smaller and non-existent. Therefore, the scheme is not in danger of failing and of having to enter the PPF. And he goes on to say as well that the government, he says that the PPF is a government body that there can be no problem of it failing to support the schemes in its portfolio. So this professor emeritus is saying that this PPF fund is supported by the government and that the USS is not in trouble, that they get government support. But, then you go into the PPF website, and I gone into the section common misconceptions about the PPF, and one of them is the PPF taxpayer funded? And they say themselves, no, compensation and the cost of running the PPF are paid for through levies on eligible pension schemes, income from our own investments, taking on the assets of schemes that transfer to the PPF, and recovering money and other assets from insolvent employers of the scheme we take on. So it's not funded by the taxpayer or the government. And then they say, is the PPF state-backed? And they answer, no, we are a public corporation set up by the Pensions Act of 2004, run by an independent board, which is responsible to Parliament through the Secretary of State for work and pensions. So here you have this professor emeritus of economics from Warwick University saying that basically it's not a problem, that the USS pension deficit is so big because the PPF will make everything okay, even though they've only got 28 billion. They're not guaranteed by the government and they're not funded by the government. And that's why people are complacent, in my opinion. People read this from a professor emeritus from a university and they think, oh, he knows what he's talking about. And it's amazing. So I think, actually, Carillion, British home stores, which went bust a few years ago, even Toys R Us, I think now, the people who have been compensated recently or are going to be compensated, they're lucky. Because I think this could get a lot worse. Here you have this PPF. They've only got 28 billion. The pensions deficit is like anywhere between 200 and 400 billion. Let's say it's 300 billion pounds or $1 trillion. I think, if anything, we're at the top of the financial asset bubble. And, if these pensions can't have a surplus while we are at the top of the market, while, everything is inflated, can you imagine what will happen when things turn? So I think it could be a huge problem for the whole of the UK economy. So it's something to keep an eye on. And don't want to be a doom merchant, but this is reality. This is out there. Is it any wonder that central bankers and governments want to keep the financial markets inflated? So if you enjoyed this video, please like, share it, subscribe to my channel if you haven't yet, and you can follow me on steemit.com as well and on Twitter. And I'll talk to you later. Bye.